Future. It was published in The Wire in July 22, 2019 issue. Then she has her article is Paramount, State and the Princely Subject, Privy Purses, Abolition and its Aftermath, in an edited book by Anupma Roy and Michael Becker. Then there is her work includes Dimensions of Constitutional Democracy, and it has been published by Springer, Singapore in 2020. The Purusharthi Refugee, Sindhi Migrants in Jaipur's Walled City. This has been her article published in number 4, January 27, 2018, Economic and Political Weekly. So I'm once again very happy, very delighted to welcome Dr. Garima, a very promising young scholar and a faculty member of Presidency University. And today we have as our discussant one more faculty member from our department, Dr. Shruti Dubey, and who happens to know Dr. Garima personally also, because they had studied in the same university, which is an added charm to this whole lecture series. And now I will ask just Dr. Dubey to contextualize Dr. Garima's topic of today's. So thank you very much, and over to Dr. Shruti Dubey for her presentation.
Thank you, Professor Shubha Rao, for giving me this opportunity to once again go back to Dr. Dhabhai's work, which I have been following, and we've been in conversation from JNU days. So our discussions have happened on the dhabas and also in conferences. So just to go back to it again and see Garima personally as well, I mean, over here, it's been a great opportunity for me. I'm just going to flag off 2 or 3 quick points, because I don't want to keep us waiting from hearing Dr. Dhabhai, and then I will raise questions later on. I think Dr. Dhabhai's work has a lot of relevance for us in the political science department, because we do teach papers on studying urban processes, and city, and she's going to talk about heritage. We know that, and it is something. Heritage is a politically contested subject. Cities have histories, cities are historical entities, and I think someone's mic is on, so if it could be put on mute, that would be nice. So coming back to my point, history is always subject to contesting interpretations. Similarly, heritage is something that is subject to contesting interpretations, and it is a politically contested category. What constitutes authentic heritage of particular cities? There are always contests about this, and therefore we see heritage being represented differently in different discourses. In state discourses, it is something else. In the quotidian, everyday discourses of the people, we see very different definitions of heritage. In fact, Dr. Dhabhai's earlier work on the Purusharthi refugees, in that work, she very deftly, traces the shifts within state discourses, how Sindhi refugees are framed very differently during the Nehruvian regime, and that signification changes with the coming in of neoliberal capital and with the construction of heritage in a particular way, which is much more consumer oriented, or oriented towards touristic economies. So it is a very, very contested subject, and therefore her work has a lot of relevance for us. Another reason why this work is relevant for us is because it is actually addressing one very important moment in urban studies and urban history. There's a shift in urban studies to reading and writing about South Asian cities. And within that, the early focus was on metropolitan cities. So whereas historically, we've seen very interesting historical works on metropolitan cities by, say, Swati Chattopadhyay, Jyoti Hosagraher, Prashant Kidambi, and so on. But the newer works are around looking at non-metropolitan centers and how the heritage discourse is shaping these non-metropolitan centers. And so we, sitting in Banaras, again, being a non-metropolitan center, and again, being at the center stage of heritage discourses, this talk becomes highly relevant for us. And the last thing that I feel is extremely important for us to, perhaps this will also come in Dr. Dhabhai's lecture, is the interface of heritage and capital. How these non-metropolitan centers, when the heritage discourses are shaping the non-metropolitan places, how their interface with global capital, with neoliberal capital, is constructing a particular definition of heritage, which seems to be exclusive, which seems to not keep up with the local practices or concerns of local communities who perhaps may be the real heritage of these cities. So I would end my comments there and invite Dr. Dhabhai to give her lecture.
Thank you. Thank you so much, first of all, Professor Rao, for inviting me for this talk. It's my privilege to, deliver a talk in your prestigious institution and have an academic engagement with the members of your department and the larger academic community that's a part of this program. I would also like to thank Shruti, Dr. Shruti Dubey, who has been a contemporary in JNU, a senior to me in JNU. And her own work has been quite inspiring and interesting, which is on the spaces, urban space in Delhi, and to look at, the informality that's imbued within the spaces of Delhi. So of course, I'm sure you're familiar with her work, and so it gives me great pleasure, and it's quite an honor for me that she gave a very wonderful context to my work, which is still in the making, which is still quite, it's something which is a work in progress, we may say. And it's a part of my today, what I'm going to speak, and part of what Shruti has already mentioned. Of course, those points would be mentioned in the presentation as well. But today what I'm going to speak is part of a larger doctoral work that I did on the heritage conservation discourse in Jaipur particularly. But what I'll also try to do is to generalize uh, the kind of argument that I'm trying to make in the context of Jaipur, to also think of urban spaces, especially non-metropolitan urban spaces in contemporary India. So I'll, because of paucity of, to structure my lecture in a proper manner, I thought I'll read out from a paper, and I may come back to some of those points in the discussion session. So also, I guess, in order to keep the audio streaming, uninterrupted, I'll just request you to bear with me, and I'll stop my video just during the delivery of the lecture, and I'll put it on again during the discussion session. So I'll just do that and begin with my lecture for today. Okay, so the title of my paper today is Between Past and Present, Heritage and the Remaking of Princely Cities. And of course, princely cities here, I'm looking at one princely city, Jaipur, but it's something that also makes me connect the discourse on heritage, which is a more contemporary discourse, to a particular aspect of regional history of which Jaipur was a part. This presentation is a small part, as I've mentioned, of my doctoral work, where I have tried to connect the emergence of heritage cities in India in the contemporary period with the global political economic processes and regional political histories in which these cities are embedded, to trace distinct practices of governance and representations of power that are built in urban fabric. When the famous ice cream, so let me start with a Winnet from the city of Jaipur. where the famous ice cream brand Naturals decided to open one of its outlets in Jaipur. It adorned its walls with motifs from the city: Hawa Mahal, peacocks, elephants, camels, and a turbaned man in the foreground with a prominent curling moustache. And you might be familiar with this image if you have seen touristic ads of Rajasthan. You know, these are very prominent symbols that are invoked in the context of quote unquote royal Rajasthan. The caption read, "Proud to be as original as the Pink City." It was a popular version of the commonly visible motifs in the city, but in a space which is unlikely to have them. I hadn't seen this kind of branding in other parlors of naturals in cities like Delhi or Kolkata, where the decor remained minimal. In Jaipur, the idea of a wall painting in colors with a stress on pink was needed to package the brand going local. This designing of the interiors of the parlor is reflective of the company's desire to appeal to the patrons of a city with a homogeneous identity represented by the brand on its shop walls. Interestingly, the chain chose to open the parlor in a thoroughly gentrified area of the city, which boasts of many other big and small cafes. I present this observation here to draw attention to the fact that Jaipur's branding and posturing as the pink city is integral to its emerging urbanity. However, in the process of naming the original pink city, as it were, it obfuscates many histories of the city which the brand did not choose to represent. This presentation would be primarily focused on Jaipur, which is the capital of western state of Rajasthan, whose spaces and surfaces are laden with a sense of past, most of the times recreated by the state. Jaipur was an erstwhile princely capital founded by Savai Jai Singh II in 1727, and today it's a bourgeoising metropolis, a million plus city. However, in the popular imagination, Jaipur is still imagined as a non metropolitan tier 2 city, even though its population has gone much beyond the census categorization. Over time, one has seen the catapulting of Jaipur into the status of a heritage city, which redefines its modernity, to which we will talk about in a brief while. This paper would connect the shaping up of heritage cities in India, such as Jaipur, with the larger global political economy, as also regional politics, to trace in it the practices of governance and representations of power. Heritage has become a buzzword in urban policy and popular discourse today. Recent UNESCO recognition to at least two old city precincts in India, which is Jaipur and Ahmedabad, has unleashed fervor among conservationists and governments alike to protect their cities and to give them heritage tag. Cities are mapped anew in terms of their heritage, both built and lived, and debates ensue over questions of preservation and authenticity. Several metropolitan cities, as well, in the recent years, have seen a rise of heritage discourse more as a resistance against conventional notions of urban development, which include creation of a metro rail or expressways or bypasses, convention centers, and the likes. While all of this qualify as urban development infrastructure in the dominant parlance, conservation of older built forms and architecture is seen as an obstruction to it. However, in a heritage laden development paradigm, which we are seeing in India today, neighborhood centric projects bring out the local as a scale of developmental practice while embedding themselves in the much broader regimes of finance, political power, and value. The story of heritage conservation and the discourse around it focuses primarily on architecture or built form, visible and intransient. It is also true of many other cities in India which have seen a bourgeoising interest in heritage. Ahmedabad is a primary example, which has been labeled as a UNESCO Heritage City in 2017. Dia da Costa, in her work, places the heritage city of Ahmedabad within the paradigm of creative economy, which creates an avenue for redefinition of what is national culture, quote unquote, and place it in a language of universality. The revaluation of yoga in recent times could be seen as another example. Ahmedabad's heritage status seems to resolve a crisis of representation in its way, trying to obfuscate the other more violent pasts of the city in Da Costa's analysis. There's also an economic underpinning to heritage in Ahmedabad. The interest in creative reskilling of locals in the heritage conservation paradigm may also be placed in the process of deindustrialization, and in Ahmedabad's case, as De Costa points out, to the closure of textile mills in the 1980s. In my own work on Jaipur, I have noted the exclusion of mohallas of Muslim craftsmen from Jaipur's heritage map owing to its religious underpinning in the city. A common refrain for these exclusions is the perception of the Muslim mohalla as dirty and its lack of upkeep. Ironically, residents of the other predominantly Hindu or Jain chowkeries also mention hygiene and waste disposal as an issue in the walled city, a point also reiterated in project reports of conservation experts. However, the sensory perception of unhygienic living conditions is articulated much more in the case of Muslim mohallas. For much of Jaipur's Hindu public, the sight of meat being sold, for instance, on the streets may itself become a marker of dirty. This may have to do with the larger politics of stereotyping the Muslim as the other and the simultaneous ghettoization of the community, which makes the mohallas inhabited by them as secluded and presumably uncomfortable for the tourists. In that sense, one can say that heritage, even though seems to be oriented towards the past, is generated through processes, technologies, and ideologies of the present. The futurity of Jaipur also seemed to rest on its acclaimed heritage, which we may define as a selective rendition of past and its interpretation to fit into the rationale of the present. Heritage underlines development in the city of Jaipur rather than contradicting it. In 2016, the government of Rajasthan launched the Smart City project in Jaipur. With a population of more than 3 million and a large urban agglomeration, the city was chosen for its blend of heritage and modernism. It is welcomed to Jaipur, which is seen as one of the finest instances of Rajput architecture and has a vibrant walled city, also known as the Pink City. In contrast with present-day Delhi and Agra, the city of Jaipur promises to transport them to an experience of tradition through its monuments and streets alike. The walled city or the Pink City is marked by a visual symmetry and homogeneity of design, something that all the conservation efforts in the city have maintained. Not just in the walled city, but even outside it, one comes across several flyovers and walls colored in the signature pink shade. In fact, it's the pink facade which is what seeks to define the city. What is ought to be represented by this facade and why? To answer this question, we will ground our attention to the projects of beautification carried out in the city of Jaipur, especially recreating the color associated with the city, which is pink. This has earned Jaipur the title of Pink City in many official and popular narratives. We'll also try to place the creation of this Pink City by the government in the political economic discourse spelt above and a design paradigm which tends to borrow from globally circulating best practices, seeking to world the local. One of the ways the design paradigm might be understood is in terms of standardization of knowledge and creation of patterned surfaces, something which Arindam Datta talks about in his work in terms of a colonial practice in 19th century India. Artistry had been reduced to drafting and reproduction of determined patterns. In the heritage discourse at present too, one senses a pattern of sorts, the development of which needs further querying. The logic of superficiality and glossy exterior marks the fetishization of old as heritage. It is no wonder then that most heritage conservation projects in Jaipur and elsewhere begin from the idea of facade restoration rather than delving much on the materiality of built form. And most of the consultation for such restoration efforts come from experts based in the centers of knowledge production like metropolitan designers, conservation architects, and so on. The story of Jaipur Pink is somewhat similar too. In order to dig out an authentic color for the city of Jaipur, the official dump under Chief Minister Vasundhara Raje of BJP at that time in 2005 scraped off layer after layer from the iconic Hawa Mahal to determine the right shade of pink, assumedly original to Jaipur. A supporting historical narrative of it being done during the late 19th century when Prince of Wales visited Jaipur buttressed the finding of the so-called authentic pink shade. Finally, the newly christened Jaipur Pink was reproduced again and again by commercial paint companies such as the Asian Paints for purpose of beautifying the city. Today, the city adorns a pink background everywhere, freshly coated in some places while fading in others. In fact, pink spells authenticity in a city like Jaipur, creating the most legitimate visual regime. So such images of the quintessential Jaipur are numerous in several archives that I've had a chance to consult. The next question is, why is such a reproduction needed and who does it authenticate? Perhaps to respond to this, one needs to delve into the political history of Rajasthan a bit and understand the implications of this visual regime marked by color. It is a color associated with the royal past of the city, and its invocation enables the city's imagination as a princely space. Its glory and aesthetics are revisited today for the purpose of revaluation of spaces and surfaces for touristic consumption. As Barbara Ramusak would say, in the era when princes have turned into entrepreneurs and also politicians. The homogeneity of color also creates a sense of spatial coherence, which binds disparate groups in a common thread, at least visually. Certain groups for staking claims to urban space may also use this strategically. The more pink an area is, the more it is seen as included in the city. The less pink are definitely less valuable to the larger visual and touristic economy at large. So while the arterial roads are all colored pink, the inner streets are not. Jain and Hindu merchants live in mohallas of the old city which are pinker than those of poor Muslim artisans. Even though their connection to the city is old, the revaluation in the present regime measured by color places them in a temporal regime outside of global modernity. The next part of this presentation will look briefly at the larger domain of urbanism that came up in post 1990s India, marked by federalization of polity and economic reforms, a point which Rob Jenkins talks of more generally. We will try to see how it changed urban aesthetics for most part too. We may place beautification projects in Jaipur within the larger history of urban development in India since 1947, and how was aesthetics thought of then with respect to development. The initial years continued to see cities as sites of industry, institutions, and infrastructure, both developmental and monumental. Within the gamut of urban centers developing in India during the Nehruvian period, let's say 1950s or early 1960s, if we think of princely cities in particular, how do we really understand their development in this period? Need was felt to erase markers of the so-called feudal past with a modern imagination of the urban space. There were concerns about what could be displayed by the way of statues or architectural designs and city plans. Especially after the legal abolition of privy purses and princely titles in 1973, concerns to reshape spaces became intense too in order to erase markers of princely past. In such a context, walled cities and princely capitals were rendered irrelevant to the economy of governance and imagination of urbanity in the early decades of high modernism, which marked urban spaces. They were seen as rotten and blight ridden, imperiling their built environments and social cultural life. The commercial core of these old cities was often maintained, changing majorly their land use pattern, but residential and social infrastructure was mostly abandoned in favor of new modern colonies coming up outside of these walled cities. The walled city of Jaipur originally has followed a similar trajectory when the city was re-territorialized following a homogeneous template of development that urban governance bodies have increasingly adopted, leading to an undifferentiated urban form, something which one may also term as the model of world-class city, borrowing from the work of Ivong and Ananya Roy. This has led to the characterization of the world cities with their particularities as old cities as opposed to the new urban similitude. Here I use this term loaded with a temporal arrangement of space, that is the term old. Within this generic model of world-class city, a contradiction began to emerge between the artistic practice and development in cities, resulting in the disintegration of royal patronage network. Specific building techniques such as araish using lime and water, particular modes of wall painting, and use of naturally acquired pigments were marginalized in the construction processes. However, the decade of 1980s in India saw a massive change in this perception of urban space as funding started coming from international agencies such as Ford Foundation and more recently from the European Union and ADB, the Asian Development Bank, for reconciling development with urban heritage, catapulting Indian cities on a path of heritage-laden development. In Jaipur in the year 1985, one such urban conservation initiative went underway under the auspices of Ford Foundation and JDA, that is the Jaipur Development Authority. Therefore, we sense a gradual displacement of decay of old cities, that kind of a paradigm, with the tropes of urban regeneration in contemporary policy discourse. A 2012 World Bank report placed these conservation attempts within an economy of uniqueness, which is conducive to the productivity of local populations. Coming to heritage discourse itself, in particular, if we look at the initial decades after independence, it was mostly artifacts which were excavated from archaeological sites such as Harappa, which were categorized as nations, cultural heritage. The other part of this definition of heritage was preservation of manuscripts. In the 1980s, Festivals of India, a part of which was also funded by the J.D. Rockefeller Foundation to augment cultural exchange, indicated a placement of performative traditions and folk culture in the bracket of Indian heritage. However, in recent time, it's becoming more and more a part of the rising global network, reflected in partnership between individual cities. So, in Jaipur's case, Jaipur, under the Indian Heritage Cities Network, participated and paired with a small French town called Lyon, which is one of the examples of how this partnership sort of comes together under the Asia Urbs program of the European Union that ran from 2001 to 2003. This packaging of local built environment and its circulation independent of national cultural discourse encourages provinces and states to lure investors and funders on their own accord. Thus, urban spectacles inducing authenticity and activation of memory could be seen in this light. The political economy of urban heritage and revaluation of the old is also connected to a neoliberal or market oriented form of representing power after the 1990s and much more today in India, which rests on branding and image creation by parties and leaders. A spectatorial public is presumed in such postures, and disciplining of urban spaces and publics becomes a part of governance. Another instance of the importance of heritage in Indian cities is the launch of a new policy by the central government under BJP in 2015 called Hriday, which is Heritage City Development and Augmentation Yojana, of which Varanasi is also a part. It seeks to employ a planned approach to tap the potential in tourism and heritage sector by unleashing the skills of local artisans. In Bengal, a state where I live, something like this happened in terms of Vishwa Bangla, which gave platform to local crafts and handloom through its boutique stores. One of the cities under Hriday undergoing revitalization and waterfront beautification is Varanasi, which also happens to be the Prime Minister's Lok Sabha constituency. The scheme aims at reviving the soul of the city in terms of upgrading its physical, social, economic, and institutional infrastructure. If one looks at the cities included in the scheme, one is struck by the overlap between heritage centers and religious centers. So, apart from Varanasi, the other cities are Amravati, Gaya, Puri, Mathura, Warangal, Amritsar, and Ajmer. All these are also tier 2 cities, and their heritage laden development will definitely revalue them as new centers of investment. And this is the hope of their municipal bodies. While the early premise of modern nation and city making in India was distancing oneself from the so-called feudal and religious idioms, or from the old walled cities, something that we see in a city like Durgapur or Chandigarh, which was built on the Nehruvian dream of industrialization and planning. Today, one sees a complete reversal of this and sees a revival of religious and cultural idiom in contemporary political practice. Heritage conservation efforts in Jaipur and Hriday in general point to that direction. However, one can say that not all tier 2 development is also linked to the religious discourse. Their coming back in the nationalist discourse is not simply confined to the logic of the nation itself. Rather, it may be placed within another logic, which is the global regimes of valuation and circulation of finance and expertise, as indicated earlier. The tapping of the local is also a signifier of flexible modes of accumulation and the new service economy, which generates novel forms of labor practices which do not require overt specialization but an effective rather connection to the city, something which I wish to probe further. This may also be part of what I would like to call sub-federal competition among municipal bodies and gentrification processes. Municipal authorities have a stake in branding their city to win more contracts and investments. For instance, in Kolkata, the Durga Puja pandal economy, something that scholars have studied now, also sees each local club claiming space and identity. This is not new, neither unique to cities in India. This impetus to city-based economies and privatization of public resources in urban areas for greater profits is part of a larger global trend that had started in the cities of the US in the 1970s. So let me go back a little, divert a little to what happened in the American cities in 1970s. David Harvey, the famous theorist, talks about how municipal bonds helped in rejuvenating cities like New York City in the 1970s. I Love NY merchandise and brand was created to lure visitors and centralized Manhattan in the imagination of New York skyscrapers, the shopping mile, and so on. Such revitalization and generation of an authentic city was also instrumental in creating a material world around it, a consumption economy. In case of Jaipur, it is the economy around pink and Hawa Mahal, which is all over in brands. Asian Colors has a shade called Jaipur Pink. There are boutique stores called Hot Pink and so on. One of the places, I studied in a school which was called St. Anselm's Pink City School. So Pink City is sort of ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the city. In recent decades, the spaces of the old city in India, which were considered to be decaying and congested, have come to be replaced by an attractive spectacle of the past with re-signification of their various features. To go back to Dia da Costa's analysis of Ahmedabad, she introduces the concept of sentimental capitalism to understand this revaluation of ruined textile mills of the city. This also reminds me of a cafe from a deindustrialized part of Brooklyn in New York City, which reconceptualized the space of factory into a chocolate boutique. This is also akin to a process of gentrification, something which several scholars of urban studies have talked about. Gentrification as a process connotes a displacement of the urban poor and taking over of those spaces by the middle class, popularly the gentry. Brooklyn in New York was one such area to be gentrified after Manhattan, when urban poor were pushed to the margins of the city. Urban improvements and revitalization is, of course, not good for everyone, for it creates enclaves of privileged past which exclude the other by labeling them as encroachers and squatters. A large part of such gentrification has taken place in the deindustrialized zones in various parts of the world post 1970s. When industries moved to locations elsewhere owing to deindustrialized production process, decentralized production process, famously known as the flexible manufacturing process, and especially when such industries moved to third world countries with cheap labor, cities in the developed world underwent this process of gentrification and deindustrialization. Winifred Curran looks at the displacement of small scale industries and blue collar workers in Williamsburg neighborhood in Brooklyn, New York, who in turn had to take recourse to informal sectors. By the turn of the century, one sees an increase in the share of service sector even in the global south, and a decline in manufacturing and basic industries like iron and coal, requiring another kind of labor force and accompanying forms of the urban. Gurgaon, Bangalore, Pune, Kolkata, especially certain parts of Kolkata, have seen this kind of growth in service industry, mainly around IT, information technology. Mumbai has always been the hub of banking and financial services. Many services around leisure and tourism have developed in relatively smaller cities such as Jaipur, Ahmedabad, Varanasi, Gwalior, Chanderi, and so on. Even Indian films, the popular Bollywood genre films, shifted their focus to these small cities in the recent past. So, if I can list a few films which are based on small cities like Bareli Ki Barfi, Padman, Shuddh Desi Romance, Stree, Ranjana, to name a few. This sort of markets these cities, brings them into popular imagination, and further them into new hubs for youth culture. As public infrastructure has shrunk and private investors grow, a new cultural and economic landscape emerges in India post 2000s. Heritage is one among many such avenues where service and a part of the increasing the growing service sector in this context that produces intangibles to be exchanged, which have got a push from the government, attracted investors in several cities, and financialized their hitherto decaying resources. In Jaipur, it is the old city which is being revitalized and sort of financialized. In places like Ahmedabad or let's say Asansol also, where there's an active community to protect heritage, it could be the old industrial and railway infrastructure. In places along, Hooghly or Ganga, it is the places along the places along the bank of the river, or even the colonial structures which are being restored, or princely structures for that matter. Incidentally, it is these very places which are changing their imaginations of being Mufassal to becoming suburbs or to the metropolitan centers. To conclude, I want to bring into focus the points that I've raised throughout this presentation, which were perhaps scattered. So let me just bring them all together. So first of all, I tried to bring out a question of political legitimacy and representation of power of an elite group through heritage conservation projects. It could be the royalty, it could be the re-evaluation of erstwhile colonial spaces, and the funding that's coming from the colonizers, the early colonizers back into the post-colony. It could be the discourse of religious nationalism and how that's sort of interfacing with heritage discourse and so on. The second point I was trying to make is to look into the political economy of heritage and how the impetus to heritage also comes from the process of revaluing new spaces and service economies with value potential in this logic, the new logic of the market, which is how to generate more funds for development. Now, the public funding is shrinking. There's a need to reinvigorate funding from diverse sources, especially to lure private investors. And so municipal bodies are anxious to brand their cities. And a part of this branding also comes from heritage. So for this, governments create brands associated with cities. Like I Love NY was a brand in New York City in the 1970s. And in many Indian cities post 1990s, we have seen the marketing of cities like Jaipur as a royal destination, or Ahmedabad's poles, or Gwalior's fort, and so on. The visual images associated with this branding circulate in the market, and which gets them tourists and investors. This is also something we called sub-federalism. Also, with this new economy, new labor force will be created to feed it, and reproduce it. And lastly, I wanted to underline the point about regional power dynamics and how older groups which have lost their power, in the context of Jaipur, it's the royalty, the princely groups, how they might want new power in their city that they ruled for so many years and centuries. So it could be the royalty, old sovereigns, or it could be the old industrial elite who would support such ventures. So heritage is therefore not just something to do with culture and experts on conservation or historians, but as students of politics, political science, we need to look beyond the surface of heritage structures and spaces and probe deeper as to why and for whom they are being produced and what meaning is being attached to them. So I'll end my presentation here. Thank you.
I begin the discussion or?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Garima, for that extremely layered and complicated. And while you were saying you've not prepared much, but it really didn't seem so from your presentation. And it was extremely, it was a very rich presentation. So I am still gathering my thoughts before, really kind of commenting on what you've said. One or two quick questions and some observations I would like to share. Some of my comments are again not very well formed because they've just struck me while I was hearing you. So pardon me for that. First one is, the first question is that, so when all of these changes to the heritage discourse is happening and when global capital is coming in a big way, and it is shaping what heritage is for the city, what is it doing, say, to the local communities? I know that you've tackled it somewhere in your earlier work. Perhaps your focus was a bit different in this presentation, but if you could talk about that a bit, how different communities are responding to this new construction of heritage and to this new revaluation of spaces, so to say, especially the marginalized communities. How are they reacting to it? What is it that is happening with their contributions to the city, to their engagements with what was or what should be called as heritage, but it's not being done. So my first question is regarding that. The second one is, and it just struck me, we have seen arguments made by, say, Neil Brenner and some others that there is a rescaling that is happening from national level to city level or to the urban level all over the world. And therefore, there is a global cities network of London, Tokyo, and so on and so forth. That argument we are well familiar with. I'm wondering if something similar is happening to tier 2 cities, and are we looking at some new kinds of networks which are getting created? For instance, you talked about Jaipur and Lyon coming together, and perhaps that was one of the representations, but I can think of Banaras and Kyoto coming together, and Kyoto being one of the, so Japan being one of the funders and one of the major architects of all the new infrastructures which are coming in Banaras, especially the Rudraksh, convention center, and there are others as well. And there are parallels which are being drawn that, that is also a heritage city, and so is Banaras. So, so capital is, coming from Kyoto to Banaras. So are we looking at some newer networks being formed, which are a little different from, say, the old, I mean, not different in terms of their operations, but different in terms of the nodes, the global nodes. So if earlier it was London, Tokyo, and Japan, or London, New York, and so on. Now it is, and Shanghai. Now it could be, Lyon, Jaipur, Banaras, Kyoto, or something similar like that. So, I think it is worthwhile to think about this question, whether something is going on over there, which then ties up to your idea about sub-federal competition. I think there is something interesting there, even from the perspective of urban governance and local governance, because this is how things are happening even in the smart cities idea. One is looking at, these small projects which are funded by in PPP modes, and which pick up certain parts of the city and then focus on them. So my third comment is again a little not very well shaped, but it is related to this, that, for instance, you talked about how pink becomes the part which is highlighted, and the entire heritage discourses around the city, the pink city. So we are seeing something similar in the case, though it's not about color, but in the case of Banaras, we can see that certain areas are being picked up, right? So there is the Vishwanath temple, and then there is Lalita Ghat, and then there is Assi Ghat. And so there are these 3-4 pockets become emblematic of the city, and some beautification drives are carried on in those pockets. And so I'm wondering whether, there is a way in which there's a politics behind what gets chosen for for heritage, what gets defined as heritage, and what gets chosen for heritage conservation. And a lot of it is about beautification and facade management, rather than going into who all inhabit the space, who all use the space. Heritage, there's also a narrowing down of the definition of heritage, which is very market-oriented, capital-oriented, and which is way away from the way in which people relate, different kinds of people relate to a place. So I'm sorry, I'm also not very, very structured, but I hope I've made some sense to you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Garima can choose to respond to this, or we can collect more questions. There can be questions in the chat box.
Okay.
And I think that, yeah. So what would you like to do? Would you like to respond to these first and then collect?
Respond to them. I mean, some of your observations, of course, thank you very much.
Even I have a question, Garima. You were very close to Shruti's question.
Okay, ma'am, please. Go ahead.
Yes. When even while I was listening to your lecture, and it was no doubt a very, very well articulated and a well framed lecture. But my observation or my just feeling as it came over me while listening to you is very close to that of Shruti's. That in your whole treatment or your your exposition, I think that the person, the people, the human beings are missing. You are all through you have talked of the materiality, as you name it, the material structure which is called heritage. But what about the invisible, but the unpalpable, but very much there, the culture of a place, the culture, the lifestyle, or the beliefs of the people who are there, or who view their city in a particular manner, the subjective element of human beings who inhabit that city. That subjectivity is missing. They are objectified, they are showcased. These cities are showcased in terms of their buildings and their parks and their architecture, but those who breathe into those structures are simply missing, and that is, I think, a sad part of this whole heritage conservation. So what do you and the scholars like you think of that invisible but very, very live element in missing in that? Thank you.
Thank you. So I'll just respond to these.
Yeah. And then we'll collect another round of questions because I can see some.
Yeah, thank you for your observations and comments and questions. So let me first address the question of reviewing. So as far as my own work and the methodology of my own work is concerned, this paper is particularly about, as you have understood rightly, the official constructions of heritage and the the way in which heritage is looked at from the side of the state or the official agencies, the global funders and so on, or the municipality, where, as Shubha ma'am was saying, the term objectification is actually quite apt. There's an objectification or commodification of the space and the people. So if you visit Jaipur's Pink City, and as a tourist, and if you go around the main roads and you're not getting into the streets or the life of the city, you're not spending too much time, you're just going, looking, and what is there to be seen, the visual complex, you're just looking at it. It seems people don't stay here. It seems the market opens like a heart, like a bazaar, it shuts down in the evening, and then what is the life of the city after that? No one really knows that. Or what is the culture of the city, as you were trying to say. The way culture is objectified and defined in the heritage discourse is very particular kind of culture, and which also ties up to Shruti's second point, that how this objectification also has a longish history perhaps into the global discourse of what is important and what is to be displayed. So, but that's a question I need to think more about, and I'll maybe come back to it. I had a few stray thoughts when you were speaking about the network of cities. But to go back to the community question, the second part of my work, which I have not really spoken about today, is about the memory of the city, or capturing the popular imagination of the city. And I'll just narrate a small anecdote from my field work, and which I narrate everywhere. Maybe some who Shruti might have heard of it. So there was this one person, a bookseller in the old city. And when I went to him, he asked me, so what is your research on? And, as an academic, trained in a particular way, the words would just cascade out. It will be like, discourse, heritage. Of course, I tried to simplify it. I did not use all the terms that I'm using in an academic presentation, but I still had that kind of a structure to how I was telling him about my research questions. And suddenly it's like, ना ना आप original plan क्या है जयपुर का उसको क्यों नहीं देख रहे हो? And I'm like, I in my head was thinking I'm actually critically trying to engage with the original or the authentic. But in his head, he had an idea of what the original is, which he, by the way, disagreed with from the entire official discourse around what is original and authentic in Jaipur.
Right.
He would keep making fun of the so-called experts from Delhi who are coming, and he's just a representative. But there were many such people who would keep saying that this is not how it is, or this is. They would laugh if they'll see photographs in newspapers about some heritage day and the walk that happened, and they'll be like, फिर से शुरू हो गया. And they wanted to participate. It's not like they did not. So one thing is dissatisfaction that we as the people of the city, inhabiting the city for so many years, maybe generations, are not getting a part of the heritage economy. We are just becoming, we can't speak in English, we can't conduct heritage walks, we are not a part of this heritage economy. So what are we? Who are we? So there was a kind of identity crisis that we are original, but we are still not authentic enough. And who are the authentic inhabitants then? Are these the ones who are just photographed? Do we need to keep mustache? Because that's another commodity which is highly valued in the context of royalty and ransom. So these are some of the concerns. The second kind of, respondents who I met, and I have done profile of some of these respondents. I mean, long kind of profiles, spoken to them several times. I don't have many respondents. It was more like an ethnographic work. And so one of the persons I met was quite an interesting Muslim gentleman from the old city, from the mohallas which are not represented in the heritage economy. And he's very sad about it, but he himself writes about Dhabhai. And small local newspapers, tries to give his inputs even to the more bigger newspapers, and tries to then talk about syncretism and coming together of cultures and Jaipur. So it's quite interesting how there are different versions of heritage on the ground, which are the more quotidian, as Shruti was saying, the more everyday versions of heritage, which do not match always with the more official and state-oriented versions of heritage, and that contradiction leads to a crisis of sorts in the cityscape. So let's say one kind of crisis would be the crisis of belonging or authenticity. Actually, if we look at the term authentic, then who is the authentic? So that would be a very kind of one response that I could think of in this to your questions. So we could take more questions then.
All right. So there is one in the chat box asked by Professor Abhinav Sharma. How Smart City project is able to match the heritage city status of Jaipur? Is there a mismatch or compatibility between the two? And then Professor Priyanka Jha wants to ask some questions. So Priyanka, go ahead and ask questions.
Thank you, Shruti. At the onset, I want to congratulate Garima for this very clear and articulate rendition of our ideas. Because this is something very distant from the kind of work that I do. But most recently, I was working something with regard to the impact of natural disasters and the question of the cultural heritage. And this paper was largely on Banaras. So, just contributing to the larger discussion which was going about people's heritage, their participation, and also what Professor Rao was indicating, what about the intangibles? What about the value system? And during my field visit and just talking to people who live in the old quarters, there was this whole thing about the Vishwanath temple, the corridor and the beautification, and how it has become so challenging for them because it's part of their everydayness. Going to the temple was part of the everydayness, but now it's just become very difficult. And also during the conversation about beautification, how people voices or their perspective was completely neglected. And I think that is a major sort of challenge that, during any kind of planning or pursuit of the heritage city, the tag of the heritage city also brings a lot of challenges. Of course, there's a lot of funds that comes, but there is absolutely a certain kind of marginalization because it's coming from a expert mentality. So how do we resolve that kind of problem? And while at Ambedkar University, there was a lot of work about People's Museum. Like there was this massive work that was being undertaken in Mehroli, whereby the community came together and they bought artifacts from their home and they created what would be considered as a People's Museum. So, the question of the intangible, the question of the absence, and there was a lot of protest in Banaras. There was a committee which was established. It was called the Dharohar Suraksha Samiti. And they were like completely, and they protested against the master plan of the corridor. But that was because the whole thing was undertaken by the Vishwanath Temple Committee. There was a organization that was set up, which was passed in the UP Legislative Assembly, and all of that. A body was created, and also how ASI was not even ASI, which is the apex body of preservation. Even ASI was not involved in that particular act. So yeah, these are just my queries, and thank you so very much. Thoroughly enjoyed. Garima, this is the first time I'm listening. I'm hearing you have read your papers, and absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. So, Shruti, should I respond to these two?
Yeah, there is one more if you would like to take that, because I think it is on similar lines.
Right.
So Ankita is asking everyone, in connection to what Professor Shubha Rao pointed out, would you agree that people make places more than places make people? Isn't it pertinent to have policy discussions around non-spatial aspects of public spaces rather than being stuck just with the spatial notions? Okay. And it continues. I also agree with Dr. Shruti that heritage is being chosen for us, where certain areas are being focused more for building the city level identity on behalf of the city. So this is also on similar lines. So now you can go ahead and address all of these.
Okay, so let me just go chronologically, and first let me address Professor Bhinav Sharma's question. So Professor Sharma, the Smart City project is actually not incompatible with the Heritage City project in Jaipur. In fact, if we look at the website of Smart City, the Jaipur Smart City, then we see that it is trying to bring together the discourse of modernity and modernism and traditions in Jaipur. So the USP to their mind, to the minds of policymaker in Jaipur, is that it's a modern city. So you have malls and you have a lot of boutique, restaurants and B&Bs and everything. Like it's a haven for a global tourist, a backpacker or a global tourist of different class. But at the same time, it's also a place where you see a certain kind of tradition being alive. And that is the first sentence, actually, if we look at the Smart City project in Jaipur. So it's not really incompatible. And in fact, what I was trying to argue in the paper is that the idea of development is not necessarily contradictory to the idea of heritage, even though traditionally it was. So if one looks at urban spaces and the making of cities in Nehruvian period, which I mentioned in the presentation, there the old or the older city or the feudal past of cities were seen as an obstruction development. But today there is a revaluation of the feudal or the old, and now they are becoming an engine of funding or so-called progress of these cities. And this is what the municipal bodies are capitalizing on. So I would say that no, they're not really incompatible projects. To come to Priyanka's comments, thank you for your comments, Priyanka. I do agree with your observations with respect to Banaras, and I did have similar experiences in Jaipur. In fact, when you mentioned Dharohar Raksha Samiti, I remembered another such body which I studied briefly in Jaipur, which is Dharohar Bachao Samiti, which is a kind of, one can say, not a mainstream heritage organization, but it's an organization of certain groups. We don't really know too much about the identities of the people who run it. I mean, I've tried to do some research on it. I've tried to do some interviews, but not possible. So I would call them, organizations which are on the fringes of the larger heritage discourse. One can say not official, one part of the popular. And this Dharohar Bachao Samiti came up in the news when the metro construction was going on in Jaipur's old city, which is now complete. And I was doing my fieldwork at that time. And during the metro construction, just like you were saying, the ASI was not really was not consulted when certain things were found underneath the walled city. Certain formations, some channels which looked like some streams which have now dried up. And so there was a lot of allegation, and there was a column that was run by a local newspaper, Rajasthan Patrika, about Dharohar Bachao, like how do we save our city and how do we save our city's heritage. And Dharohar Bachao Samiti was sort of complicit in this kind of a narrative, where they said that how the state is destroying heritage. And the only response that the metro construction agency, the Jaipur Metro Rail Corporation had was that we will actually do up the metro stations in the same color. It will be the same design. It will look the same as the old city. So don't worry. But they had a problem with what was happening to the structures underneath while the construction is going on. So it's very true that these versions, the compatibility is there between the development paradigm and heritage paradigm. But what is incompatible is definitions of heritage actually, and how it's being defined, and what are the meanings attached to particular spaces. And that brings me to the question of Ankita, and which is a very interesting question, and somewhat philosophical. I mean, one has to think more deeply about this, whether places make people or people make places. But I think place, I'll just take recourse to what I know as a theorist, which is very boring, not very philosophical at this moment, which is Lefebvre and how he thinks of places. And they are not just geographical, kind of entities, but they are social. They are imbued with meaning. And this is what we see in the case of Jaipur or in the case of Banaras in different contexts, that it's not really places which will, the architecture of places definitely, but is architecture also pre-given, or is architecture also something that's created historically over a period of time, and how it then arranges people around it and social relations around it. So I think that is a conundrum, but I would say that no place or no space will be empty, or it's as Lefebvre will famously start his work. That's not really an abstract conception of space that we're working with, but it's laden with value, it's laden with meaning. And that's what we are trying to grapple with here when it comes to a heritage urban space, for instance. Right? So, yeah.
Are there any more questions? I can't see any in the chat box. So if the questions aren't there, then I would like to invite Professor Shubha Rao to give a vote of thanks.
Thank you, Shruti. And bigger thank you to Dr. Garima, and an even bigger thank you to all our listeners who sacrificed their weekend activities, as I must say, for the sake of this lecture. And Dr. Garima has very, very aptly answered the queries posed to her. And finally, Dr. Garima, the painful question remains that gradually and very systematically and in lot many words, the real जिसको हम आत्मा कहते हैं किसी शहर की, that soul of the city is compromised. And this pains the inhabitants and all the sympathetic viewers who don't belong to that city, but who love and respect that city for its originality. In the name of originality, it's a dead originality, a lifeless originality, which is being preserved by state intervention, and the real lively individuality is compromised, or it is neglected. So, thank you for activating our minds in this direction, and thank you very much once again, Dr. Garima. We cherish your lecture and your presentation very much. Thank you.
For inviting me, and thank you, Shruti, thank you, Priyanka, thank you everyone for engaging in the discussion. helping me think through, and I still have a lot to think about. I'm trying to develop this doctoral dissertation into a piece of writing. I don't know what form, but maybe soon. I'm still grappling with it. So thank you so much.
Well, the pleasure was ours.